Welcome back to Huawei Routing and Switching Elite Training for HCIE. Today topic we are going to discuss on ISIS. Let's start our part 6.
To ensure network security, ISIS will use the authentication, and this authentication can be encrypted or using a plain text. So first, we are looking into different type of authentication. So here we have 3 types. The first type is called interface authentication. So assuming that I have 2 routers here, and this one is my 010, 010, so I can implement authentication in the interface. And this interface authentication can be used for L1 or L2. Okay, so we call it as an interface authentication. Now the second method of authentication or the authentication type is called area authentication. Area authentication is done on only for L1. Okay, and the authentication can be done on our SNP or sequence network PDU and the LSP, okay, the link state PDU. Whereas for the routing domain authentication, it only authenticate level 2 SNP and the LSP. So remember that we have 3 types of authentication, and most likely in your exam, these 3 type of authentication you have to be familiar with. The authentication mode here include the null authentication. Basically means that we have no authentication, plain text, and the MD5. Even on the MD5, you also can use a keychain if you want it to be more configurable. All right, let's look into the authentication in ISIS. Let's go to the router 4. So right now in my router 4, when I look into my peering, so you can see that the peering between router 4 and router 5 under the gig 0 is basically running. Okay, it has been up for quite some time. What we're going to do now is that we are going to set some security between router 4 and router 5. So first I'm going to show you the interface authentication. So it's pretty simple. We just go to ISIS authentication mode. The mode that we have include the keychain, MD5, and simple. So if I'm going to use a simple password, I'm going to say that this is a plain password, so that when you do a display current, you're able to see the password. I'm going to say that Huawei, and I have an option to send as a layer 1, layer 2, or I'm going to use an OSI or IP. So assuming that I just said enter, and by default when you press enter, you will use the OSI L1 and L2. Okay, now before that I'm going to do a Wireshark. Okay, I'm going to do a capture. Alright, so let me minimize here, and I'm going to press enter. Okay, so after a while you notice that the peering will go down. So display ISIS peer. Okay, there you see it's go down, and gig 00 is no longer there. Okay, and when I look into my Wireshark, you'll notice that this is a place that I have the authentication. Let me show you the authentication under the hello here. Alright, under the hello, you're able to see that there's one called authentication, and you notice that the password here is Huawei. Now this is before, so before that I do not have authentication, and after that I have the authentication. So that is the clear password, so that's not that secure. But anyway, let's configure on the router 5. Now in router 5, okay, we are going to do this same thing, but before that let me go back to router 4. I want to show you this command, the display ISIS error, and let's do a pipe here, bad authentication. Okay, so notice that I have a bad authentication over here. Alright, so that is not good, and I'm going to fix that now. And if I go to router 5 here, okay, what I'm going to do is I just go to do this copy and paste. That will be easiest for me. Now because this is in plain, I'm able to do that. So I just go into the gig 000 and paste it there, enter, and when I do a display ISIS peering, okay, so now it's up again, and that is how simple you can configure your authentication that's using a plain text. And as you can see from here, okay, they actually do a synchronization. There's the sending of the LSP, the CSMP, all right, and there's a hello. Alright, and you can see from here that's our password. Now what I'm going to do is here I'm going to close my Wireshark. I'm going to use another method, very simple one. So instead of using the authentication simple, we are going to use an authentication mode called MD5, and I would like to use a cipher and Huawei. Okay, so I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to start the Wireshark one more time. Okay, let it run, and I'm going to put it here on the router 4, so you can see that when you do a cipher you weren't able to see the text, and when I do a display ISIS peer, you'll notice that it came up. And when we look into the Wireshark, alright, so let's have a look into our hello packet now. That's our hello packet, that's our authentication, and you notice that the password is encrypted. Alright, so that is our authentication on the interface. Next we are going to look into the different type of authentication. One is the domain authentication. Alright, so let's have a look. Let's look into domain authentication. So on the router 2, I do receive a L2 from router 4. So just to show you here. Okay, so we have the level 2, and these are the level 2 that I received from router 4, and same go for the router 3. So when I look into LSDB, it's all work fine, and when I go into my routing protocol, and I'm able to see 4 and 5, and this is being propagated through by router 4. Now in the domain authentication, we are going to authenticate L2, the LSP. So let's go into the router 2. We are going to say that domain authentication mode MD5. I'm going to say that the password is called Huawei. Okay, so I configure this domain authentication on both router 2 and router 3. So let me paste it here. Okay, so since this authentication is configured on router 2 and router 3 and have not configured on router 4, what will happen here is when router 4 advertise the 4 network and 5 network to either 2 or 3, it will get failed authentication. So if let's say I go back and do a display IP route protocol ISIS, you notice that the 4 and 5 is not there, and earlier on before I have authentication, you can see that 4 and 5 is here, and clearly router 1 will also fail to receive display IP routing protocol ISIS. You'll notice that even though I do a leaking, because there's no information that received from 2 and 3. Okay, so that's a domain authentication. So for me to fix this, I need to go back into router 4. I'm going to put the same authentication. I configure the same authentication. Then if I go back to router 1, there you go. Alright, so this is the L2 information, and this L2 information has been authenticated by R2 and R3. Finally, we are going to look into area authentication. So we have router 4 and router 5. So when we look into router 4 and router 5, their relationship here, if I do a display ISIS as DB, you can see that router 5 are running on level 1, and here I have a network 5.5. Now if I go to router 1, you can see that the 5.5 is available. Okay, now I'm going to configure the area authentication which authenticate level 1. So if I go to ISIS in router 4, I'm going to say the area authentication mode MD5 cipher password is Huawei. Okay, I just do it on router 4, and when router 5 advertise its network to router 4 will fail the authentication because the password is not configured on router 5. Now the effect you're able to see on either router 2, 3 or 1. So if I go back to router 1, and when I do a display IP route, you'll notice that network number 5 is gone. Okay, before this you can see that network number 1 network number 5, and once I configure the authentication on area authentication, number 5 is gone. Now for me to solve this, I just go back into router 5. I'm going to match the authentication using the area authentication, press enter, go back to router 1, and the effect is the 5 network come back. So what you have seen here is I'll show you 3-type authentication in ISIS, which is the interface authentication, domain authentication, and area authentication. Now one way for you to verify that the authentication has done successfully, because if let's say you done it on the interface, you're able to see that when you do a display ISIS peering, you're able to see that the interface is not up. Alright, so what we did just now is a area authentication and domain authentication, and this authentication is authenticate based on LSP, and for you to verify that, you have to use this command, display ISIS LSDB verbose. Okay, so this is the level 1, and you can see that I have authentication there. So this is an area authentication, and this is my domain authentication level 2, and you also can see that there is an MD5 here that is successfully configured. Alright, so that actually show you the authentication is in action. ISIS carry the route using LSP. Okay, so what will happen if let's say the number of route that need to be carried exceed the capability of the LSP? So this slide explains how you can extend the LSP capability by using a feature called Fragment extension. Alright, so in the ISIS router, when we are going to send our LSP, there is a feature called Fragment, which consists of 1 byte. This fragment byte allows you to create up to 256 fragments. So in another word, we can able to fragment our advertisement, the LSP, up to 256 fragment. And if let's say I'm going to do the math over here, if I have 1 fragment, okay, that can cater roughly about 1470 byte, okay, that is including the overhead. And if I'm going to times by 256 fragment, I will give it will give us a calculation roughly about 376,320 byte. Okay, that if you going to translate into the number of route, roughly about 42,000 route that the single system ID can carry. Now in a very huge network, 42,000 may not be sufficient. So under such a circumstances, which is quite rare, now we can actually enable what we call the fragment extension. Now what it does over here is that using a simple method we call as a virtual system. Okay, now this virtual system basically using the same network entity. For example, if I'm going to use a 49.0.0.0.1, this is my network entity, and my system ID is assumed that I'm going to use this number. Okay, so here I can only generate 256 segments. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another virtual system. In this virtual system, I'm going to remain this one as the same, my network ID is the same, but I'm going to create another virtual system. Alright, so I will expand it to another 256 segment. So it will give me additional 42,000. So I have 84,000 of the route that I can carry. So that is the concept behind of the fragment extension. So how many virtual system I can extend? Alright, I can extend up to 50 virtual system. Right? Okay, so let's look into some of the configuration. Now for you to configure the Huawei router to support the extended Fragment, we have two modes, namely mode number 1 and mode number 2. Now, if we look into the mode number 1, R1 has enabled for Fragment extension. R2 do not support Fragment extension, so we call this as mode 1. In mode 2, both of the router do support the fragmentation, okay, Fragment extension. Now, for us to configure the fragmentation, what you need to do here is that we are going to go to the ISIS process. Okay, that's my first step. So once you are inside there, you are going to tell the ISIS to use a fragment feature. Okay. Then you are going to tell them that which level that you are going to use. Will it be level 1 or 2? So by default it's level 1, 2, and you are going to tell them that this is mode number 1. And once you have enabled the fragment extend feature, you are going to tell them that what is your virtual system ID. So the virtual system ID basically referring to this particular ID just now mentioned here. So I'm going to use, okay, so this is the ID I'm going to use. So the command here is called virtual system quad 0 quad 0 002. That's it. So these three commands enable you to extend the fragment extension, and you can exponentially or increase the number of the router on the ISIS that can carry. So we have mode number 1 and mode number 2. In this demo, we are going to look into LSP fragment extension capability. So here I have a topology with 3 routers. So router 3 have a network entity of 47002, whereas router 1 and router 2 belong to the same network 47001. Okay, so let's just look into the configuration. So on router 3, when I look into the current configuration of ISIS, so this is a L2 routers, and this is my network, and this is my system. Okay, so when I do a display ISIS statistic, okay, so as you can see from here, this is my statistic of the router number 3. This is a pure L2, and more importantly, I would like you to concentrate on this configuration. So currently the LSP is using the system ID of 0003. Okay, so I do have a good pairing. Okay, so I have a good pairing between router 1, okay, which is using gig 000, and router 2, which is using serial 101. Okay, both of these are L2. Now let's just examine the configuration on how to extend the LSP fragmentation. Now for you to do that, first we go to the ISIS configuration and we turn on the LSP fragment. So here we are using a L2, so we are going to tell them that this is a level 2. Now they do have 2 modes, and by default mode number 1 is the default. Okay, so since this is a default, we can just ignore it, but for our case over here, I can just type in mode number 1, display this. You can see that even a type mode number 1 is not available, but it's okay. So the next command here is the virtual system. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier on, the maximum virtual system that we can support, they are 50 virtual systems. So for our case over here, we are going to enter another system ID. Okay, so earlier on the 0003 is being used, so I'm going to use another ID over here, 0000033 for example. Okay, so that's it. So I have just enabled the features on the ISIS to enable the LSP fragmentation. So just to verify that this is really true, so I just do a display ISIS statistic. Okay, so you can see that now I have 2 of these LSP source ID. Okay, that currently is not being used yet. Alright, so that is the LSP fragmentation with the extension.
Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel.